The summer between my freshman and sophomore years of high school, I participated in a program called People to People Student Ambassadors. It was a 3-week cultural immersion trip to England, Ireland, and Wales, and it was pretty amazing. We visited Parliament and went on the London Eye. I saw more sheep and low stone walls than I could ever hope to count. I rappelled down the side of a castle. I even kissed the Blarney Stone and wasn't at all grossed out by the fact that they don't sanitize it in between people. I actually thought about that from time to time during COVID, wondering how or if their protocols had to change. Alyssa and I plan to travel to Ireland at some point, so whenever we do, we'll be sure to report back on that one for you. We also did 2 homestays with local families, one in England and one in Ireland, and we were encouraged to bring thank you gifts for the families. I got a few things, but the one that I remember the most was this little redwood sapling that I bought at Muir Woods. It came in this little plastic tube, and it was probably only about a foot tall. I thought that it was such a unique present and that they would be absolutely thrilled. Problem was, these families hosted kids from the Bay Area every single summer. And all of those kids had the exact same idea about bringing a little bit of California to the UK. I realized that when I saw that they had a San Francisco wall calendar of some kind hanging in almost every room of the house. And unfortunately, I was not the first to bring them a redwood tree either. I don't know if they ever planted it, but I like to imagine that there's just this random house in England with 10 to 20 juvenile redwood trees scattered all over the property. One of the most amazing things about redwoods is that they actually rely on forest fires for their survival. Their cones will lay dormant on the forest floor until they are exposed to the heat of a forest fire, which causes them to dry up and release their seeds. It seems so counterintuitive that something we think of as being a source of death and destruction is actually exactly what redwoods need to bring about new life. And yet that is exactly what Jesus is talking about in our gospel reading for today. We're bouncing around a little bit in terms of the timeline of Jesus' story. Our passage for today happens immediately after his triumphant entrance into Jerusalem, which we will hear about next week on Palm Sunday. I can only imagine how the disciples must have been feeling at this point. Jesus had just raised Lazarus from the dead. His fame was spreading far and wide, so much so that even foreigners from Greece were asking to see him. And sure, the whole Messiah thing had not exactly gone as the disciples had expected. Jesus got off to a real hot start with turning over the tables in the temple, but ever since then, it had been a lot less empire toppling and a lot more profound yet incredibly confusing metaphors about who he was and what the kingdom of heaven is like. But now things are finally starting to get back on track. Now he is finally starting to act like the Messiah that they have been waiting for. The one who would overthrow the occupying Roman forces and free the oppressed people of Israel, who would claim the throne of his ancestor David, taking his rightful place as the one true king. He had even entered into Jerusalem with the equivalent fanfare of a Roman general returning from war. And sure, those generals usually rode into the city on a war horse, and instead Jesus rode in on a donkey, but those are just minor details. But as we know, there are no minor details when it comes to Jesus. Everything that he does has a purpose and meaning to it. And instead of agreeing to sign autographs or whatever it was that the Greeks who wanted to see him were hoping for, Jesus instead starts talking to his disciples about the kind of death that awaits him, a death that will occur far sooner than any of the disciples can imagine. Now, in Jesus' defense, this is not new information. This isn't the first or second or even third time that he has mentioned his eventual death and resurrection. He's been talking about it since chapter 2, and he's used a bunch of different metaphors to try and make his point. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. I am the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. But it just hasn't hit home yet. Too bad the disciples didn't know about redwoods, because that would have been a great example. But they do know about wheat. So he tries once again. Very truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Now, if you're anything like me, my first reaction to that statement was, is that true? Does a seed actually have to die in order for it to grow into a plant? I mean, I'm no biologist, and I didn't love science as a subject when I was in school, but that just doesn't seem like it's right. And can we really trust a carpenter when it comes to matters of agriculture? So I did some research, and I found that the answer depends on who you ask and whether they interpret that statement literally or metaphorically. A literalist would say, absolutely not. That's ridiculous. Once a thing is dead, it's dead. It might help another organism to grow by providing it with nutrients or other resources, so I guess, in a way, death can lead to new life, but the story of Frankenstein and even young Frankenstein are just pure fiction. Now, in response to that, someone who takes it metaphorically might say to the literalists, you're kind of missing the point. No, the seed doesn't technically die, but it does die in the sense that it ceases to be what it is, so that it can become what it was always meant to be. When a plant bursts forth from the ground, it's not like you can just dig up the dirt and find that original seed somewhere under the earth. It's not there anymore, which is an echo of the words that will be spoken by the angel at the tomb on Easter Sunday. But the seed is gone, transformed, and in its place is the plant that it was always destined to become. And that's what Jesus is talking about here. He's trying to tell the disciples that he is about to change from who he is into who he is meant to be. And the process of becoming who he is meant to be is going to look a little different than what the disciples are probably expecting. It will indeed end in the glorification of God's name, just as Jesus talks about, but that glory will be achieved not through domination or conquest, but through the counterintuitive way of the cross. It will be achieved through death and resurrection. And I doubt that that idea made much sense to the disciples, because in that day and age, there was only one way to achieve glory, and that was through power, might, victory, sheer force of will, total domination of one's enemies. That is the worldly way to glory, but it is not Jesus' way. He subverts all of that and redefines how we understand power. Jesus will ride into Jerusalem next week on the back of a donkey instead of a war horse, not because there weren't any war horses available at the time, but because he is making a statement that his is a different kind of power. That true power is not found in strength or might or the ability to control. It is instead found in love, sacrifice, service, and vulnerability. Vulnerability isn't a word that we tend to associate much with the notion of power. While the narrative around vulnerability has changed somewhat in recent years, for most of history, it wasn't thought of as being a particularly good or positive thing. A vulnerability is a liability. We attack our enemies where they are most vulnerable. In society, we talk about the vulnerable as being people who are susceptible to exploitation or manipulation. Vulnerability is something that should be hidden away, not flaunted, and it's certainly not the first thing that comes to mind when we think about God. When it comes to God, we are much more likely to opt for one of the omnis, omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and yet, so much of how God operates in the world through Jesus highlights the importance of vulnerability. Starting with the fact that Jesus came into this world as a baby, one of the most precious and vulnerable things on earth, and culminating in the fact that he laid down his life for our sake, so that God's power, a power that is made perfect in weakness, might be shown for all the world to see. It was a display of power that completely contradicted what the disciples must have been expecting. Jesus' transformation, the glorification of God, will come not via the world's definition of power, but through God's definition. And God's power is a self-sacrificing kind of power, a loving form of power, a vulnerable type of power. Vulnerability is a fascinating topic, and there are few people on earth that know more about it than the world-famous researcher, storyteller, podcaster, and all-around incredible human being, Brené Brown. Most of her work on the subject relates to trying to figure out what it is that human beings need in order to thrive. And much of her research shows that in order to thrive, we need connection. And in order to build connection, you guessed it, we need to be vulnerable. It makes sense, though, doesn't it? How connected do you feel to someone when your conversations with them are only ever surface level? When it feels like they're holding you at arm's length, not letting you in? We need to be vulnerable with one another in order to truly feel connected to one another. And her research backs that up. In her studies, those who opted for vulnerability, despite knowing that there was a chance that they could be hurt, were still ultimately happier and had more satisfying relationships, over and against people who chose to engage in behaviors that prioritized protecting themselves, guarding against pain and seeking certainty and choosing safer paths. Now, I'm not telling you to pour out your life story and your deepest fears and your social security number to the next stranger that you meet on the street. Even Brené Brown tempers her advocacy for vulnerability by adding the fact that not everyone has earned the right to hear your story. But as she points out, the more we armor ourselves up and hunker down, safe inside our little shells, the less and less likely it is that we will be able to experience the joy and connection and fulfillment that we so crave. In short, the less likely we are to experience the abundant life that God intends for us. Because as much as this metaphor about the grain of wheat is intended to help us understand Jesus' death and resurrection, it was also meant for us as well. The only way that we will ever be able to come that which we are meant to be is if we are brave enough to be vulnerable and open ourselves up to the transformative new life that God offers us in and through the person of Jesus. The shell of a seed helps to keep that future plant safe, protects it from danger, and yet it also restricts and limits that future plant, rendering it unable to reach its fullest potential. And Jesus is telling us that we mustn't be so afraid of death that we never truly live. And in order to live as the people whom God created us to be, we will need to die to some of the old ways of doing things. Die to some of the things that are either within ourselves or in the world around us that are restricting us, holding us back, hemming us in. We will need to be planted and be bold enough, brave enough, to be vulnerable enough to open ourselves up to a new way of being in the world. A way that does not bow down to the world's definitions of power and glory, but rather proclaims a different way, Jesus' way, the way of death and resurrection. In our baptismal liturgy, we speak of being baptized into Christ's death, so that we might die to our old sinful selves and be raised to new life in Jesus. Jesus' death was literal. Ours is meant to be metaphorical, and in either case, new life is the end result. But as with most things, timing is everything. Some seeds lay dormant for centuries. Others require very specific conditions for them to begin to root and grow. Jesus himself waited until his hour had come and the time was right. So the question that remains is whether or not the time is right for us, whether or not we are ready to be planted, ready to leave behind our fear of death, not because it is no longer scary, but because Jesus has forever and always inextricably linked death to new life? Are we ready to leave behind that which we are so that we can become that which we are meant to be? Amen.